In a modest building in Palo Alto, California in 1957, 8 young engineers were about to create the future. They had just walked out on their abusive boss, William Shockley, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had co-invented the transistor. They had no product nor customers, but what they did have was talent, and the shared belief that silicon transistors would change everything. With backing from Fairchild Camera and Instrument, their venture became Fairchild Semiconductor. Today, the microchip industry these men helped create is the most strategically important industry on Earth. Nations compete for semiconductor supremacy the way they once competed for oil or steel. The United States restricts chip exports to adversaries. China spends more annually importing semiconductors than on oil. Taiwan, producing most of the world's advanced chips, sits at the center of geopolitical tension. At its essence, a microchip is a switch, billions of microscopic switches etched into silicon. These switches turn on and off millions of times per second, creating the ones and zeros that form digital information. They perform calculations, store memories, process images, and transmit data. Yet 65 years ago, none of this existed. The integrated circuit, multiple components on a single piece of silicon, had not been invented. The semiconductor industry itself barely existed. Electronics were still built with vacuum tubes and individual transistors wired together by hand. Fairchild Semiconductor didn't just help invent the microchip, it invented a system for innovation itself. New manufacturing processes, new financing models through venture capital, and a culture of entrepreneurship that transformed California's fruit orchards into Silicon Valley. To understand it, we must first understand what came before. Part 1. The Traitorous 8. In the age of Edison, innovation meant trying everything available. Working in his Menlo Park laboratory, he tested thousands of materials for the light bulb filament: platinum, bamboo, even horsehair. This empirical approach surprisingly produced inventions, but struggled to predict or explain why things worked. By the 1920s, a new model emerged. Bell Laboratories was fundamentally different. There, researchers studied the fundamental properties of matter and developed new materials from first principles. The telephone company grasped a revolutionary truth. Innovation required science and research, not just experimentation. This was where William Shockley arrived in the late 1930s after completing his doctorate at MIT. Shockley was brilliant, abrasive, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. His obsession was semiconductors, materials like silicon and germanium that weren't quite conductors and weren't quite insulators. When doped with tiny amounts of elements like phosphorus or boron and exposed to an electric field, these semiconductors could conduct electricity, suggesting a device that could amplify or switch signals without the bulk and fragility of vacuum tubes. On December 16, 1947, 2 of Shockley's colleagues at Bell Labs, Walter Brattain and John Bardeen, pressed 2 gold filaments against a block of germanium and controlled the current flowing through it. They had created the first transistor. Shockley, furious his colleagues had beaten him, locked himself in a Chicago hotel room over Christmas 1947 and designed a better transistor. 3 layers that could both amplify and switch. On, off. The heartbeat of digital computing. The Nobel Prize came for the 3 of them in 1956. But Shockley wanted wealth. He struck out on his own and established Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View, California, recruiting brilliant young engineers. But for all of his theoretical brilliance, Shockley was a terrible manager, creating a toxic atmosphere through public firings, harsh suspicion, and even lie detector tests. By 1957, 8 of his top employees had had enough. They would be known as the Traitorous 8, though history would remember them as founders. 8 young engineers: Gordon Moore, Robert Noyce, Gene Horney, Eugene Kleiner, Jay Last, Julius Blank, Victor Greenwich, and Sheldon Roberts, decided to quit Shockley Semiconductor and start their own company. In 1957, this was unheard of. Engineers didn't leave stable positions at established companies to strike out on their own. Scientists certainly didn't become entrepreneurs. They wrote to an investment firm in New York. Their letter was part business proposal, part plea. They had technical expertise and wanted to continue working together, but had no capital. Their message reached Arthur Rock, a young investment banker who saw something others missed. This wasn't just about building better transistors. It was about creating an entirely new kind of company. Arthur Rock found them a sponsor, Fairchild Camera and Instrument, a struggling Long Island military contractor. The deal was revolutionary. Fairchild would provide $1.5 million in startup capital in exchange for an option to buy the company 2 years later for $3 million. If the engineers succeeded, they would become wealthy. This structure, founders keeping equity, investors taking calculated risks, the possibility of enormous returns, became the template for Silicon Valley financing and the birth of venture capital as we know it. Part 2. Fairchild Semiconductor. In 1958, Fairchild Semiconductor occupied 12,000 square feet of empty warehouse space in Palo Alto. The founders had no manufacturing equipment, no established processes, and no customers. What they did have was a deadline. By August, their Fairchild camera backers expected results. The semiconductor market they entered was primitive and precarious. Texas Instruments and a handful of other companies produced transistors one at a time, mostly from germanium using crude alloying techniques. Each device was individually assembled, tested, and packaged. More craft than manufacturing. Prices were high, yields were low, and reliability was questionable. The military didn't care about cost. The Pentagon was pouring money into anything that could make missiles lighter, radars more powerful, and computers smaller. For the emerging space program and nuclear weapons race, transistors offered a crucial advantage. Unlike vacuum tubes, they didn't burn out or shatter from vibration. But the traitorous eight had bet on a new approach entirely. They would work with silicon rather than germanium, and they would use diffusion, carefully controlling how impurities spread through the silicon at high temperatures, to create transistors in batches rather than individually. Their first product, announced in August 1958, was the 2N696, a silicon mesa transistor. Mesa because the finished device looked like a tiny plateau rising from the silicon surface. It could operate at temperatures that would destroy germanium devices, and it could switch faster than anything on the market. The military loved it. Orders flooded in for applications the founders had never imagined: guidance systems, radar installations, early computers for bombers and submarines. Within months, Fairchild was shipping thousands of transistors monthly. But Jean Huerny, the theoretical physicist among the founders, saw the Mesa transistor's fatal flaw: the exposed junction. The critical boundary between different types of silicon was vulnerable to contamination, moisture, and physical damage. Devices failed unpredictably in the field. In January 1959, Huerny had a revelation. What if the junction never needed to be exposed? What if they could use silicon dioxide, the natural oxide that forms on silicon's surface, as a protective layer, opening windows through it only where connections were needed? He called it the planar process, and it changed everything. The oxide protected the delicate junctions. It acted as a mask during manufacturing, allowing precise control over where impurities diffused. Suddenly, transistors could be made smaller, more reliable, and cheaper. By late 1959, Fairchild had transformed itself. The company employed hundreds, operated sophisticated diffusion furnaces and photolithography equipment, and dominated the high-performance transistor market. Gordon Moore, running research and development, established what became Silicon Valley orthodoxy: document everything, standardize processes, iterate rapidly. The founders had created something unprecedented: a technology company that operated like a production line, where breakthroughs in the laboratory translated within months into products shipping by the thousands. But success bred tension. Fairchild Camera exercised its option in 1959, buying the semiconductor division outright. The founders received substantial payments, but they no longer controlled their creation. New management from the East Coast didn't understand the culture the founders had built. Decision-making slowed. Talented engineers grew frustrated. The question wasn't whether people would leave. It was when. Yet even as these fractures appeared, the planar process had unlocked possibilities that would transform the industry entirely. The most revolutionary idea was still to come. Part 3. The Microchip. Robert Noyce stared at the planar transistors coming off Fairchild's production lines in early 1959 and saw beyond what they were to what they could become. The electronics industry faced a fundamental problem: the tyranny of numbers. As circuits grew more complex, requiring dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of components, the task of wiring them together by hand became impossibly expensive and unreliable. Every soldered connection was a potential failure point. Engineers called it the interconnection problem, and it threatened to strangle the computer revolution in its infancy. Noyce realized that Hoerny's planar process had quietly solved it. If silicon dioxide could protect transistors and act as a mask for diffusion, why not use it to build entire circuits on a single piece of silicon? Transistors, resistors, capacitors, all fabricated together, interconnected by thin metal films deposited on the surface. No hand wiring, no individual assembly. Just photograph the pattern onto the silicon and let chemistry do the rest. In his patent notebook, dated January 23, 1959, Noyce sketched the concept. Multiple components integrated on a single chip of silicon, connected by aluminum traces running across the oxide surface. What Noyce didn't know was that 6 months earlier, at Texas Instruments in Dallas, Jack Kilby had demonstrated a similar idea. Working with germanium and tiny flying wires connecting components, Kilby had shown his supervisors a crude but functional integrated circuit in September 1958. In another historical example of simultaneous invention, Kilby had proven the concept. But it was Noyce who had invented the future. The difference was manufacturability. Kilby's approach required painstakingly attaching individual wires to each chip, better than hand wiring a circuit board, but still essentially craft production. Noyce's planar integrated circuit could be mass-produced using photolithography, the same techniques already making thousands of transistors. The patent battle between Texas Instruments and Fairchild would drag on for years, eventually settled by cross-licensing agreements. History would credit both men as co-inventors, but the industry would build on Noyce's approach. Fairchild's first integrated circuits, introduced in 1961 under the Microchip brand, were simple, basic logic gates containing just a few transistors each. The military, desperate for smaller and lighter electronics for missiles and spacecraft, paid premium prices. NASA's Apollo guidance computer would eventually use thousands of Fairchild chips to navigate to the moon. Gordon Moore, analyzing the progress in 1965, noticed a pattern. The number of components that could fit economically on a chip was doubling roughly every year. He predicted this exponential growth would continue, though he later revised his estimate to doubling every 2 years. Moore's law became the semiconductor industry's heartbeat. Part observation, part self-fulfilling prophecy, part challenge. And more significantly, the integrated circuit made computers practical. Before it, computers filled rooms, cost millions, and were accessible only to governments and corporations. The integrated circuit would shrink computers to desks and eventually pockets. It made possible calculators, personal computers, the internet, and smartphones. But as Fairchild's technology soared, its corporate culture fractured. The East Coast management of Fairchild Camera treated the semiconductor division as a cash cow, siphoning profits to fund other ventures while centralizing decision-making back in New York. The engineers who had built the company watched their autonomy evaporate. Stock options, the carrot that had lured talent to risky startups, weren't being offered to new employees. In 1967, Charlie Spork left to lead National Semiconductor. In 1968, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, two of the original 8, walked out to found their own company. They took Andy Grove, Fairchild's brilliant and abrasive director of operations, with them. They called it Intel, short for Integrated Electronics. Jerry Sanders, Fairchild's charismatic marketing director, departed the same year to establish Advanced Micro Devices. Eugene Kleiner became a venture capitalist, co-founding Kleiner Perkins, which would finance Apple, Google, and Amazon. The exodus continued throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. Fairchild veterans founded or staffed nearly every major semiconductor company in Silicon Valley. Fairchild Semiconductor had become what one observer called the Fair Children, a corporate parent whose offspring would define an entire industry. By the mid-1970s, more than 50 companies could trace their lineage directly back to that warehouse in Palo Alto. Epilogue. We live in a world shaped by ideas that once didn't exist. Venture capital seems obvious today, but in 1957, it had to be invented. Arthur Rock's deal with Fairchild, founders keeping equity, investors taking calculated risks, created the template that funded Intel, Apple, and Silicon Valley itself. The same is true for semiconductor manufacturing. Fairchild turned breakthroughs into reproducible processes. Modern fabrication facilities cost over $20 billion to build and operate, in clean rooms thousands of times cleaner than hospitals. The integrated circuit created global dependencies. Manufacturing dispersed worldwide, with design centered in America and production concentrated in Taiwan. TSMC now makes over half the world's semiconductors. Taiwan became indispensable and a geopolitical pressure point between the United States and China. Moore's law drove exponential improvement for decades. The computing power that filled rooms in 1969 now fits in a smartphone with 1 million times more capability. This miniaturization enabled artificial intelligence and transformed every industry. What Fairchild invented wasn't just technology, it was a system. Ideas flow through people moving between companies. Failure is accepted. Success breeds new ventures as engineers leave to start over. 65 years later, semiconductors have become as strategic as oil once was. They power AI, smartphones, weapons systems, and surveillance networks. Control over advanced chips means control over technology itself. From 8 engineers with no product and no customers emerged an entire industry and the system that perpetuates it. The modest warehouse in Palo Alto is long gone, but what the traitorous 8 created there, the belief that talent, capital, and freedom to fail could transform industries, continues to shape the world. This was Makers of the Microchip by Christophe Lécuyer and David Brock, first published in 2010. Thank you for listening.